Today is September 30, 2025. When we talk about history, we're also talking about power. Who gets remembered, who gets honored, who gets erased. I was recently reading about how Boston University debated for years the changing of a dorm's name. BU dropped the name Myles Standish Hall. The dorm is now just 610 Beacon Street. Now, they didn't make this choice lightly. They made it because Myles Standish was celebrated in colonial lore as a military protector and a hero. But he was also a man who unleashed violence, terror, and massacres against indigenous people in New England after the Mayflower 1620 landing. There is documented proof of this. And almost as soon as this decision was announced, the chorus of complaints rose up all over the internet. And I was reading some of them. Several of the repeated comments were along the lines of, "This is revisionist history." Other comments were along the lines of, "Woke people are destroying the heroic American image." And a lot more were saying, "We're losing our history." If this feels familiar, it should. We heard the same arguments when the Christopher Columbus statue was removed in downtown Chicago and it was removed elsewhere in the country. But let's pause here and ask an honest question. Whose history are we talking about? For generations, textbooks and monuments presented Myles Standish as a hero. But if you were a Wampanoag or any of the other native peoples who faced the sharp edge of his sword, he was not a hero. He was an oppressor, a figure whose protection of the Plymouth settlement meant the death and displacement of your ancestors. When Boston University honors him with a dormitory name, it isn't just remembering history, it's choosing sides in history. It's declaring that his violence is worth celebrating, but his victims don't count. And this isn't just about Massachusetts or about Christopher Columbus in Chicago. This is something I've seen in my own hometown of Honolulu. For years and years, ever since I was a little boy, there have been debates about renaming William McKinley High School and Theodore Roosevelt High School. These aren't just abstract arguments. They're about what names Hawaiian students see every morning when they walk into class, what lessons they absorb from the built environment around them. Before McKinley and Roosevelt became presidents, they were loud voices for something called manifest destiny, for the expansion of American power at the expense of indigenous nations and sovereign peoples. Now, McKinley oversaw the annexation of Hawaii. Roosevelt championed the ideology that justified it. Together, their policies stripped the native Hawaiian kingdom of its sovereignty, pushed aside its peaceful queen, and imposed the will of outsiders on a people of color. Now, let's be honest. I've admired Roosevelt in other contexts. I love his progressive policies. He stood up to robber barons. He protected national parks. He supported workers. He even had the first ideas of national health insurance. I think Roosevelt would have been in his element arguing for these things today. His platform stated a belief in, and I'm going to quote this from his platform, the protection of home life against the hazards of sickness, irregular employment, and old age through the adoption of a system of social insurance adapted to American use. Today, I can hear MAGA already screaming at me if I quoted this to them as being socialist or even communist. He was one of the most forward-thinking leaders of his time in those areas. But as much as I admire him, I can't ignore the fact that in Hawaii, his name is tied to conquest and colonization. That is the legacy stamped on the walls of Roosevelt High School. Same with McKinley High School. That is what Hawaiian students are asked to celebrate: white domination over a brown-skinned kingdom. This is why the argument that we're losing history, quote-unquote, doesn't hold water. The history of Myles Standish, of Columbus, of McKinley, of Roosevelt, it isn't going anywhere. History is not being erased like MAGA talking heads are screaming. Scholars will keep studying them. Students will keep learning about them. What's changing isn't the history itself. What's changing is our judgment about who deserves the honor. Because let's be clear, statues, plaques, and building names are not neutral. They're not just reminders of the past. They are celebrations. They say, this person is a role model. This person represents the best of us. Keeping those honors in place while ignoring the victims is not teaching history. It's distorting history. It's telling only half the story, and half the story is a lie. Now imagine you're a native student at BU. Every time you walk past a dorm named for Myles Standish, you're reminded of the massacres your ancestors suffered. Imagine you're a Hawaiian teenager at McKinley High School. Every time you say your school's name, you're reminded of the leaders who stole your nation's sovereignty. This isn't neutral history. It's humiliation. Humiliation disguised as civic pride. Revisionist history is not about fabricating lies. It's about refusing to stop at the sanitized version. It's about listening to voices that were silenced for centuries and integrating them into the narrative. History is not a frozen monument. It's a living conversation across generations. Each generation has the responsibility to tell it more truthfully than the last. And that's especially true in Hawaii, where the struggle for sovereignty is not just a matter of history books, but of daily life. Native Hawaiians continue to fight for land rights on Mauna Kea, to protect sacred spaces from development, to revive the Hawaiian language that was once outlawed in schools, to demand housing justice as land is swallowed up by resorts and absentee investors. Every one of those fights is connected to the legacy of McKinley and Roosevelt, the legacy of an imposed annexation that turned a sovereign nation into a colony and eventually a state without the consent of its rooted people. So when Hawaiians say those school names need to change, they are not just talking about the past, they are talking about dignity in the present. They are saying we deserve schools that honor leaders who represent our culture, our survival, our future, not the men who stole our sovereignty. And that's the point. Renaming buildings and taking down statues is not about erasing history. It's about refusing to enshrine oppression as something noble. It's about choosing truth over myth, dignity over domination. So the next time someone says, we are losing our history, we should answer with a conviction. No, we're finally telling it right. And in telling it right, we're giving justice a voice.